Big wedding weekend here at Christ the King. One yesterday, one today, and one tomorrow. And if you can't get away from weddings, it's also in the gospel. Let's look more closely at Matthew's story and then ask what it might be saying to us today. In our day, we get invitations to a wedding that says it's going to be held on such and such a date at such and such a time. And you might even get a save the date ahead of the invitation. So it's pretty clear as to when it's going to be. That wasn't the case in the time of Jesus. Then you just received a general invitation that there's going to be a wedding sometime this spring. And when everything is ready, then you get a second invitation. Come to the feast, everything is ready. So Jesus uses that ordinary understanding and custom of his day to make a point through this parable. In the story, the second notice was given, but people ignored the invitation. Some made up excuses and others simply failed to show up. The king became furious, the story goes, and even more so when some of his people were killed by those invited to the wedding. He retaliates by destroying the town and then invites others from whatever place they are to come to the feast. The point of the story up to that section is clear. It applies really to the Jews who were invited to the feast, but when the prophets appeared to announce the coming of the Messiah, they rejected the call, and most of the prophets were killed. The invitation to the feast, the kingdom of God, is then opened up to include everyone, and not just the chosen people. Matthew's gospel then adds a postscript to the story. Some would say it's really a separate parable. A man comes to the banquet but does not have on a wedding garment. The king sees this and is insulted. One author would say that it's something like wearing a bathing suit in our culture to a formal wedding. I couldn't say just jeans and sneakers, but it's not unusual to see jeans and sneakers at a wedding. Sometimes even the bride is wearing flip-flops. Some might argue that the poor man only received the invitation at the last minute and did not have the required garment with him. But this misses the point that we're simply dealing with a story, and that the point that is being made is that even though that is kind of an open-door policy to the kingdom, there is still responsibility on the part of those invited to be properly dressed. And we are dressed according to the way that we live, according to the decisions that we make. How does this speak to us here and now? The story says that each one of us is valued by the Lord, loved by the Lord, and thus invited to the feast. I guess the real question for us is whether or not we are dressed in an appropriate wedding garment. The gospel is an invitation to look at ourselves in a mirror and see what we have on, not in the literal sense, but in a symbolic way. Have we updated our spiritual wardrobe lately with an honest examination of our conscience, with a candid examination of how we are living our lives? Do I see my religious commitment having a direct influence on other areas in my life? For example, on my business ethics, or my treatment of others in school or in the workplace. The story of the wedding is actually a story about our lives. What kind of an RSVP are we sending the Lord?